if we don't know what we know, how we know it, we'll just take this Joe Schmo's argument and say, oh, well, that's an argument that makes sense. And if you look at it through his lens, everything makes sense through everybody's lens. You need to define your terms so that you know how to move forward. Otherwise, you're going to be looking through everybody else's freaking point of view, and you'll never know. You'll never have any answers because, oh, well, his argument makes sense. That argument makes sense. That argument makes sense. And if you have no basis for knowledge, you can never come to a conclusion. So it filters out bad arguments. You can now spot when people are using purely empiricism or purely rationalism, and you can say, okay, well, while that makes sense in that little bubble, while that makes sense for his point of view, I'm not going to accept that as true because he is just looking at it through this point of view, and I know that you can't do that. You need a little bit of this, you need a little bit of that, right? So that is why this knowledge topic is so important. Let us give it a rip. Okay, so welcome back to another episode, my friends. Today's topic is knowledge. Knowledge. The reason I'm doing this episode about knowledge is because if I'm thinking logically about this whole process, right? I did the introduction last week about identity and how to find your identity. I mean, kind of how I'm going to be going through this and figuring out, is God real? And I'm doing that through this kind of systematic way. And this is the first episode of this series, Is God Real? So I wanted to talk about why this is so important real quick, why this topic even matters, because, you know, it may seem so obvious to everybody. Everybody listening may be thinking, like, why are you talking about what is knowledge? Because, you know, it's just such a basic question, but the more you think about it, the more you study it, research it, the more you kind of understand that there's much more to this topic than you might think. So I wanted to think of, if I was thinking in my own life, so I have these personal experiences with you know, angels, demons, whatever. You could argue that was my perception of it, but demons and God saving me and stuff like that. Some people may believe, some people may not. That's okay, whatever. That doesn't matter. But in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so I had these experiences, but how do I know that they're real? And how do you know something? Like, if I'm going to be putting on this lens for the rest of my life, you know, what you believe shapes the rest of your life, as we discussed in the last episode. You need to define your terms, basically. But I wanted to know, like, how am I going to go about this whole God thing? So in my mind, I was thinking, okay, so if I have these experiences, but I'm still having doubts or questions or problems with believing, I'm not sure that I know these things to be true. And so I was like, how do you know anything to be true? How do you know anything? What is knowledge? So that's kind of what we're going to be going through. And this is so important because if we are going to get deep into these topics, we need to be sure to define what we are talking about. So if we're going to see if God is real or not, and what the point of life is, we need to know what is knowledge and how can we have it, and what are some different ways of coming to understand things. So because if we're going to study what truths are out there, right, and what arguments are being made for or against God, we need to understand that not all the arguments people make are equal, and not all of them are valid. And how people argue their beliefs and stances are different. So one person may believe that you can come to know something one way, and the other person may come to believe that you can know something a different way. And so different things are convincing for different people, right? So while somebody may have an experience and say, yes, that is knowledge, the other person, a skeptic maybe, may say, how can you trust that experience? How can you know that that is true? Because I experience things all the time, and that doesn't make it true. Or that doesn't mean I know this thing, right? So we're not talking about necessarily truth today. We're going to be getting into that next episode. But if we're going to study, okay. So that's kind of why this is so important. But the first question to answer would be, can we even have knowledge? And if you say no, you're kind of just a total skeptic, which is okay. I love that. But, if we're going to be productive here, I think the majority of people would say, yes, you can have knowledge. So, and I believe, well, I've questioned that a lot. But, just for the sake of this episode, yes, you can have knowledge. So I can get into another skepticism episode another time, but, I want to stay productive and stay on track. So that's, yes, you can have knowledge. So if the answer is yes, though, then we need to know how we know something and how there are different ways that philosophers have come to understand knowledge. So how can you know something? And there's a whole bunch of different ways people might argue you can know something. You can have knowledge in all these different, from different ways, which is what we're going to get into today. So how can you have knowledge? How can you know anything, basically? And we're going to look at some of the different viewpoints on that. So the first one is going to be okay, so before we get into this real quick, this is gonna be kind of a hefty topic. This is probably gonna be a longer episode. I'm gonna try and keep it somewhat short for you guys, normal length. But there's so much important content in this episode that I'm gonna be kind of cramming in. So, just letting you know, there's a lot in here. And this has taken a long time of studying, watching other people talk about it, watching debates about it, listening to professionals, reading books, reading philosophy. Like, there's so much to this topic, and there's so much that I can't even touch on in this episode. But I kind of have I'm going to blanket everything almost like umbrella, kind of try and hit the most important points, the points that make the most sense, because there's just so much. Like, people could spend their entire lives studying this topic right here. So let's get into it, my friends. I am so freaking stoked. So the first way you can come to know something is, well, a view, which I would also argue that it is also a view of truth, not necessarily knowledge. So there is a difference, and we're going to get into that next week, I believe, or next episode. I think I'm going to talk about truth and morality next. But how can you know anything? What are the different ways that people come to know something? Let's get into it. So the first one is relativism. Relativism is the view that there is, so yes, this is a little bit relativism. The first one is a little bit more about truth rather than knowledge, but the view that truth knowledge, values, or reality are not absolute, but vary according to different perspectives, cultures, or contexts. So I'm not going to spend much time here because I'm going to talk about this in the next episode. But relativism is saying that everyone or everything we know is relative and there's no absolute truth. There's no absolute knowledge or morality. So it's almost a skeptic view in knowledge, but not necessarily truth. And that every culture forms their own beliefs. So it is a cultural thing, but at the same time, I don't think relativism is more, it's not about really knowledge as much as truth. So relativism is kind of what we Americans are mainly seeing in our society, is that everyone has their own truth, everybody has their own belief or set of morals. And while I think, there is some good to that, I think I have a hard time like fully accepting the relativist view on life, because I mean there's a lot to it. Now that I'm like actually talking about this, I'm like, this is way more like this is for next episode. This is for morality and truth. So I'm gonna move on. We're gonna talk about relativism next week, but it's okay. This episode is still gonna have plenty of content. So, how can we know anything? How can we have knowledge? What is knowledge? One view would be rationalism. So rationalism is the belief or theory that opinions and actions should be based on reason and knowledge rather than on religious belief or emotional response. So that view, this rationalist view, is kind of how I was going to go about this whole "is God real" thing. I was going to say, like, I wanted to look at it in a purely rational sense. I wanted to define terms. I wanted to come to a purely logical reason for God's existence. Like, I wanted there to be evidence. Like, I wanted there, like, I needed this to make sense. So it is the belief or theory that opinions and actions should be based on. Okay, so where was I? I was talking about, I got a phone call. So I was talking about rationalism. So that's kind of the view that I was trying to go about this. But studying knowledge and the different forms of knowledge, how somebody can come to know something, the different opinions and stuff, like, has shifted my view, and I'll explain that once we get into the next part. But rationalism is, I'm a huge fan of rationalism, this way of thinking, as this is like primarily how I was going to go about this whole thing, right? Is how I was going to go about figuring out these existential questions. I was thinking the only way I can come to know these answers and know these things is if I come up with a logical answer, if I, come up with some systematic evidence, whatever. That's kind of how I was going about this. But yeah. So rationalists believe things because arguments that logically make sense are true. So rationalists believe that if something logically makes sense, then that makes something true. And I was like, okay, that makes so much sense. Like, that's how I want to go about this, right? But rationalism is the theory that reason rather than experience is the foundation of certainty in knowledge. And it makes so it makes logic the ultimate authority in belief, where the next part, empiricism, is making experience the ultimate authority in belief. So now this view is also very tempting to view everything through, but it won't suffice for this. It's not going to work 100% for this. Answering these existential questions, because logically we want to come up with answers to these questions. We want to come up with logical answers to why do we exist? What's my purpose? What's my meaning? What's the meaning in life? Is God real? We want to come up with these logical answers for these questions, but not all logic should be purely followed. And that is something that I have come to realize, that not all logic should be purely followed. And I've had a problem with this like many times. I'll come up with or think about some theory that makes sense logically, but is not true or cannot be proven true in any way other than logically. So logic is kind of this little bubble in your mind. It's this little reality bubble in your mind that, everything makes sense. You've got this little argument bubble right here, and inside that little bubble, everything makes sense. But you are completely disregarding everything outside that bubble. You are completely, let's say that bubble might cover even a huge area of the world. It might be 98%, but there's still that 2% that you have to account for. And since it's not 98%, but just for easy example, right? So I would come up with some theory or something that makes sense. So the reason I've come to realize that you cannot purely base your entire, the reason everything is just through a logical argument, is because, you can create a whole logical argument inside these bubbles and it not be true, or it just not be line up with reality. And it gets it can't be true, or it can't or it can't be proven true in any way other than logically. And that is that's where it gets dangerous. That's where thinking in this purely rationalist view gets pretty dangerous. So, because if you rely solely on logical thinking, you get caught in traps. You get caught in mind traps. So there's different logical frameworks, and this doesn't guarantee truth. So if you want to have this rationalist view, and you're going to view the entire world okay, I have to have some logical reasoning, which I would say is the minority. I would say most people don't live this way, but that's how I was choosing to go about this. I would say most people are empiricists more than rationalists, but, I think most people just don't think about it because they don't really need to. You know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. And it's that simple, but it's not that simple. It's not that simple. So, I'm going to give you a quick example here, though. So, Kant, he's a philosopher. Kant's rationalist ethics says, act only according to the maxim which you can will to become universal law. And what he means by that, so I'm going to say it one more time, act only according to the maxim which you can will to become universal law. And so, in other words, Kant believed that people can figure out what's right or wrong using pure reason alone by asking whether a rule they followed could logically apply to everyone. So he was kind of saying, he took this rationalist view, and he's saying, okay, so morality. If it logically makes sense to do or not to do something, then you have your answer. So he's saying if you can figure out what's right and wrong using pure reason alone by asking whether a rule they followed could logically apply to everyone, then you have your answers. So he's saying, like, through this rationalist view, if murder makes sense logically, if you can make sense of it logically for it not being a bad thing, then that must apply to everyone. So then, therefore, murder must not be wrong. And there's a lot of people that would argue. So there's this one guy, this is going into our morality topic for next episode, but he argues that there is no evil and there is only experience, and there's only, I don't know, I'll get into it next episode, but basically, if you're taking Kant's view, saying that, you can figure out what's right and wrong using pure reason alone, and then you take the view of this other philosopher guy who's saying that there is no evil. Even Plato says this. Plato says there is no evil, there's just ignorance of truth. So let's just say that you don't know something is wrong, and then, like, I don't know. I hope this makes sense. I'm kind of butchering it a little bit, which is very disappointing. I'm disappointed in myself for that one. But Kant's rational ethics act only according to that maxim which you can will to become universal law. You can't figure out what's right and wrong using pure reason. And psychology agrees with that statement, and says that in reality, humans don't make moral decisions by cold, rational deduction. Instead, we are deeply influenced by emotions and unconscious biases and cultural norms. So, like, people are people. They feel things. There's that level of subconscious biases, cultural norms, these emotions that even if you think they don't affect you, they do, even if it's on a subconscious level. So you can come up with this logical argument for why murder is right or why murder is wrong. Like, you can come up with some logical argument for why murder is right. But emotionally, you may feel that doesn't feel right. That just doesn't feel right. And I'm kind of like on the line of talking about morality, but that's for next week. But I'm just saying, like, logically, you can come up with an argument for something. In this little bubble you've got, in this bubble, it makes sense. That totally makes sense. But then you're discounting. You're getting rid of the. You're not looking at the emotional sense. You're not looking at the biases you may have, or the cultural norms, things that may influence you. Additionally, the reason we cannot solely base truth and knowledge in just logical thinking is because sometimes logical thinking can lead to false conclusions. And this is usually because there is, like, a false premise in our logic. But for example, something I've wondered a lot about. So this is going to be pretty heavy. So some of you guys who struggle with mental health and stuff, like, or if you're sensitive to topics like that, I would suggest maybe clicking off now. I don't know. I'm on YouTube now, so that's kind of, I'm giving you a warning or whatever. So, but I have wondered so many so many times, okay, like just a thought experiment. I'm not saying to do anything or to not do anything. Just purely thinking, okay? So this is just a thought, okay? But under premise 1 in this rationalist view, I believe, like, if I have this thought that life has no intrinsic meaning, purpose, or reason, there's no reason for my existence, there's no purpose or meaning for my existence. Premise 2, if something lacks meaning or purpose, it should be ended. If something doesn't have a reason to be, then what's the point in it being, right? Conclusion, therefore, I should not be anymore. Does that make sense? So in my mind, I'm thinking, if life has no meaning or purpose or reason, why am I here? So I know that one's kind of heavy, so I'll give you another one just to make it a little bit easier. Why we can't solely base our lives off of this rationalist view. Why we can't just view the world through this logical argument, because it gets rid of everything else. So premise 1, if something can't be scientifically proven, if you're logically thinking this, if this is how you view the world, if something can't be scientifically proven, that is premise 1. Premise 2, love can't be scientifically proven. Conclusion, therefore love isn't real. Now, if you believe that something can't be scientifically proven, it's not real, you can't prove that love is real, therefore love is not real. Does that make sense? So that is a logical argument that makes sense. It makes sense. But there is, fault in our premises. So I did come up with a logical argument for ending life, I guess. It's a lot of premises and stuff, but there is logical arguments for why ending life could be the right thing to do. But you watching, you listening, and me telling you this, believe that is just not right. That is just not right. You're not supposed to do that. You shouldn't do that. Why? Because that little emotion? Because that little... You see what I'm saying? So logically, if you can come to a conclusion that if something can't be proven, then it's not real. Well, then love's not real. You see what I'm saying? So that's why we have to define this term. We have to define our terms. What is knowledge? How can we have knowledge? Because we now know that you cannot solely view things through this purely rationalist view. At least some people can. There's many philosophers that do. But me personally, I don't believe that it's just not right. You're disregarding so much in life if you solely look at things through some logical argument. Like I made this argument for ending life, right? If life has no meaning and purpose, and you are suffering, and you view the world in a rationalist point of view, meaning and purpose give your life a reason to endure the suffering. If you are lacking those things, those answers, that why for living, then logically it would make sense to not exist anymore. And that like really scared me almost when I really thought about this for like 2 whole days, man. I was like asking ChatGPT and stuff like, is this logical argument, is this valid, does it, and we worked some things out and whatever, but we came to the conclusion that logically you could make an argument for terrible things. You could make a logical argument for so much because it's in this little bubble. It's in this little bubble of reality of what ifs. This little, but deep down, you have a sense, you're like, man, that's not right. Even though logically that makes sense, logically you can make this argument and it could be true, but that's just not right. There have been several philosophers who have debated the question. And I don't want to get too much on the weeds because I'm already running out of time here. So we'll move on to this last point. There's many philosophers who have debated the question, if life has no meaning or purpose or reason, what is the point in living? Many philosophers. And I don't want to I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but logic itself is based on truth and is built from inputs from experience. Without getting too deep into this, so while logical reasoning is crucial to answer some of these questions, some of these existential questions, you need it. I'm not saying that rationalism is bad, because I think you need it. It cannot be the sole source for finding these answers. Because some things need empiricism, which is what we're going to be getting into next. Some things need empiricism, which is because logic requires input, which are these premises. So logic requires premises, which is the input, and empirical experience provides that input. So without empirical data, logic has nothing to work with. Without empirical data, logic has nothing to work with. So if you're trying to decide the safest route to work, logic can help you make that decision. Logic can help you figure out what's the best way to go to work. However, empirical experience is knowing traffic patterns, construction zones, how many lights are on this route, how many stop signs are on that route, how many turns you want to take, how many miles you want to drive. That's empirical evidence. You need those inputs in order to make a decision, right? Those things are needed to know. So let's say if you're trying to find the fastest route to work, and there's construction zones or whatever, like that's an input. That's that. Whatever. I think I got my point across. You need empirical evidence to apply the correct reasoning. So you can have reasoning. So like this route may be the fastest, but if you have some construction zone, it's not the fastest anymore probably. And so you need to find the correct route, the fastest route. You need to have that empiricism, that evidence, that experience, right? So now let's get into empiricism. This last point of how can you have knowledge? What is knowledge? How can you know anything? And you have the view of empiricism. So empiricism is the view that all knowledge comes from sensory experience. And empiricism is like the core of scientific thinking, the core of how scientists view the world almost. Observation, experimentation, and direct evidence. That is how scientists do their jobs. So now, some famous philosophers also believed that you could only come to know something if you have personally experienced it, or if there's some experience from it. So, and I think this view on the world has its strengths and its weaknesses for sure. So, many of you may be thinking, oh, that cannot be true because I know this and that. I read this book, I watched this documentary, I saw this YouTube video, whatever, so I know this thing to be true. However, these philosophers would argue that you can only come to know something through your own experience. Because sure, you may have heard somebody else's testimony, but can you really know that that's true? Can you really trust that is... Can you really know that for yourself? Which is kind of a little bit of skepticism, but that is kind of the argument that they would make. So let me pause this real quick. I need to replace the battery. Anyway, so what we were talking about is some famous philosophers believed that you can only come to know something through personal experience, or some people would just argue that you can only come to know something through experience, whether it's yours or somebody else's. So it has its strengths and its weaknesses, but in this dialogue, Theaetetus, which is by Plato, yes, I read Plato. I read my first philosopher, which was actually a lot of fun. So I'm so freaking stoked to be talking about this today because I have done the work. Okay, so in this dialogue, Theaetetus, Plato explores the nature of knowledge by examining three possible definitions. So the question of the dialogue is, what is knowledge? How can you know something? And the first definition was, knowledge is perception. Theaetetus is this young kid who says knowledge is perception. So in this dialogue, Plato has Socrates question this definition, knowledge is perception, by showing how perception varies greatly among individuals. So perception, one person may, there's two people sitting outside right next to each other, and one person believes that it's cold outside, while the other person believes that it's hot outside. And so Plato says, making it unreliable as a foundation for knowledge. So he basically says that, well, if one person can perceive one thing and the other person can perceive the same thing a different way, that is not a reliable foundation for knowledge. Can you really know something if one person knows it to be that and the other person knows it to be this, right? And this variability undermines the idea that we perceive directly, that what we perceive directly constitutes knowledge. So it's in this long dialogue. Long story short, knowledge cannot be solely perception because people view things in different ways, right? So the second definition in Theaetetus was knowledge as true judgment. Knowledge is true judgment. So true perception basically is what they say in the dialogue. So dismissed again. This is the second definition that has been dismissed. So it's not just perception, but it's not also true perception, because true judgment or perception can be lucky or mistaken. So you can't know something if it's just lucky or mistaken. So Socrates challenges this idea that knowledge is true judgment by offering examples where someone can make a true claim saying something that is true, like correctly guessing the number of beans in a jar without actually knowing why it's true. So this makes the judgment lucky and not knowledge. You see what I'm saying? So they go through this. Knowledge is perception. It can't be perception because different people view things different ways. So it can't just be that, because that's not reliable. It can't be true perception, true judgment, because you can get lucky. You can't just, you can't say how many beans are in this jar if it's just a guess, right? You're just taking a guess at it. So the third definition in this book was knowledge is true judgment with an account. So it comes from it comes closest. This definition of knowledge comes closest to the modern ideas of justified true belief. But Plato remains skeptical here as well. So he kind of finishes the dialogue saying, well, we don't exactly know what knowledge is, but we want you to figure it out. Like we've given you our thoughts, so now think about it yourself and try and come up with your own conclusion. Justified true belief. It's what is knowledge? Like, it's like one of those things where we all kind of know, but what does it mean? Nobody can really answer that. I mean, some people can. But it highlights the this dialogue highlights the difficulty of defining knowledge. Okay, I cut out for a second. Of defining knowledge and suggesting that we must be cautious in accepting any simple definition. So, what the heck? What did I do? I started doing my scripts a little bit different, so I don't know what I'm looking at here. There is limitations to this empiricist view. So, empiricism meaning, let's go back to the definition. Here we go. All knowledge comes from sensory experience. There's limitations to this point of view because not all truths are testable or observable, such as morality. If you can't see it, you can't, I guess you could say you could feel it, but that's not an experience. Like, you can't prove it. Empiricism is about proving these things through sensory experience. Morality, love, metaphysics, you could even argue space if you're a conspiracy theorist. Anyways, some experiences are subjective and not easily verified, such as religious experience. So that is kind of why. Now I'm going to circle back to the beginning, which is why I had to hold my tongue earlier. I was having a hard time with this intro because I was trying to say what I'm saying right now. Experience cannot solely be knowledge because you can't always measure experience. You can't always test experience. Empiricism is saying that the knowledge comes from sensory experience, and it must be testable. So if I can see this thing, if I do this experiment or whatever, and I can see this outcome or whatever, then I know that this thing is true. If I can see this and I can test it and I can repeat it and do it again, I know that is knowledge. But you can't test morality. You can't test love. You can't test metaphysics. You can't see these things. You might be able to feel them, but you can't experiment with them. You cannot prove them to be true. You cannot prove these things to be true. Right? So some experiences are subjective and not easily verified, like love, morality, metaphysics, whatever, and religious experience. So that is why I'm defining this term right now, because in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if I want to come to know who God is through this logical definition, if I want to know, but I'm also thinking, okay, so I've had these experiences with God in the past. I've had these experiences with demons or whatever, right? At least that was my perception. And now we know that you cannot solely know something based off of perception. That is what I knew at the time. Okay, so that was my perception. But different people view things differently. So in my mind, I'm thinking, I got a little bit skeptic of this view. I was like, can I really base the entire rest of my life on this experience? Can I really build the rest of my life based off of this experience that I had? And I perceived it to be one way. However, I know that I grew up in a Christian home. I know that I've been grown up a certain way. So I've had these beliefs all my life, right? And so I'm thinking, if I was in a Hindu household, if I was in a Buddhist household or whatever, and I had these experiences, how would I view that situation? Would I view it in the same way? Would I view it as the God of the Bible saved me? Would I view it as angels and demons? Or would I view it as depression? Would I view it as, how would I view it then? It was a perception. Can I really base my life on this experience? If I may have had the wrong perception. And I was like, no, I can't. So originally getting into this whole God topic, I was thinking, okay, so I can't base anything off of experience. I can't base anything off of just empiricism, off of feelings, off of perception, off of things that I have experienced. You can't just know something based off of experience. That is how I was going into this whole thing, but I've come to realize that you can have faulty logic too. You can come to some crazy whack freaking conclusions logically in this little bubble if you disregard the experience. So you need one another. You need... sorry, I'm getting into my conclusion a little bit, but sensory information can be misleading as well. And so I'm thinking, if, like, there's optical illusions, there's biased perceptions, right? Like this, if I grew up in a Hindu household, how would I perceive this situation? If I was an atheist, how would I view this situation? There's biases, there is optical illusions, there's mirages, right? And so because of these things and a little bit of skepticism, I think, I was like, I can't just base the rest of my life. I can't just view the whole rest of the world through this perception if I haven't seen the other perceptions, if I haven't seen what other people are seeing, how they're viewing the world, right? And that's why this is very important. But you cannot just view things through a logical argument either, because you can make a logical argument for why murder is right and why there is no morality. or you can make a logical argument for, all sorts of crazy things, right? Which most of you may disagree with, or you could agree with. I'm somebody who, I don't know, I get caught up in that stuff a lot. So that's all I'm trying to say here, is that you cannot solely base knowledge. You cannot just know something based off of some logical argument, but you can't just know something through some experience that you've had, because perceptions can be wrong. You can see things wrong. You can experience them a different way than other people, right? So I just don't think that solely basing knowledge on experience is very, it's not a very strong foundation. I don't think it's, what's the word I'm trying to use here? I can't think of the word I'm trying to use. It's just, it's, I literally can't think of the word I'm trying to use. That's going to kill me now. But you can't, okay, so now I've defined everything. I did my best. I've done so much research into these topics, but now I know. When I was going into this through this logical, I need to have these logical arguments for this and that, disregard all of the experience. I've now come to understand that you need experience. You need these things. It is very important. Both sides play a huge role. You can't just live life through this logical framework. And the reason I say that, okay, so because I'm such a thinker, okay? So I'm thinking like, if I currently don't have any meaning or purpose in life, and I don't know what those things are, and I'm suffering, I have depression all the time, I have anxiety, whatever. Your meaning and your purpose in life is the reason you choose to endure through your suffering, the reason you choose to live your life, the reason you do what you do, basically. And if I have none of that, then what is the point in suffering? What is the point in enduring, right? And so through this logical argument, I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, okay, well, if meaning and purpose is the ultimate why for existence and why I should live, then like, why should I live right now? But also, like, I came to this logical conclusion that I cannot enjoy my life until I have answers. And so I was getting super upset. I was getting super depressed. I was like, man, I can't enjoy life because I don't know why I am living it. Through this purely logical point of view, I was pretty upset, pretty depressed, because I was like, well, experience has nothing to do with it. It's not about being happy. And you can't be happy if you don't know. Until I came to realize that you can still enjoy life if you don't have all the answers. You can still feel things. You can still experience life without understanding everything. You don't have to understand why you're here. Sometimes you can still experience it and still enjoy it. And so, my friends, relativism, which I'll get into more, like, I had this whole script for it, like this episode would be like an hour and 30 minutes, but I completely skipped through that just about. Relativism, I think I'll get into next time, but it shows the diversity of thought. Rationalism structures thought. Empiricism tests it. So there's no single method of knowledge is enough alone. You can't just have logic. You can't just have empiricism. And you can't just have relativism, which I'll get into in the next episode. Trust. You need to explore life's biggest questions using all of them. And you have to understand, understanding how we know what we know helps us filter out bad arguments. It helps us clarify our beliefs. It helps us engage with topics like God and morality and meaning. If we don't know what we know, how we know it, we'll just take this Joe Schmo's argument and say, oh, well, that's an argument that makes sense. And if you look at it through his lens, everything makes sense through everybody's lens. You need to define your terms so that you know how to move forward. Otherwise, you're going to be looking through everybody else's freaking point of view, and you'll never know. You'll never have any answers because, oh, well, his argument makes sense. That argument makes sense. That argument makes sense. And if you have no basis for knowledge, you can never come to a conclusion. So it filters out bad arguments. You can now spot when people are using purely empiricism or purely rationalism, and you can say, okay, well, while that makes sense in that little bubble, while that makes sense for his point of view, I'm not going to accept that as true because he is just looking at it through this point of view, and I know that you can't do that. You need a little bit of this, you need a little bit of that, right? So that is why this knowledge topic is so important, because it filters out bad arguments and it clarifies our beliefs. So, thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, comment, subscribe, whatever. I'm just kidding. But thank you so much for listening to the end. I know this was a very long episode. It has a lot in it. Next time, we're going to be talking about truth and morality, I believe. Should be another 2 to 3 weeks. I'm going on vacation, so it might be a little bit. So thank you so much if you made it this far. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace.